the ward or in the OPD or anywhere? Anybody has any experience? Yes, final years? Anybody? No? Okay. Okay, so no one is responding. So basically, important to know how to take history for your level, for final years, even for the exam. If you get a case scenario, you will be required, or the objective will be to know what is important points, the history, and a little bit about examination, because you will not be asked to do examination. You will not be supposed to do examination, particularly per speculum, per vaginal examination. That's not required for your level. So what is required from you is basically how to diagnose on the basis of history, gynecological history, or presenting complaint or presenting symptoms, and how to evaluate for cervical cancer. So, like I said, usually it is diagnosed at stage 3 or 4, and that is why the mortality is very high, and also morbidity of treatment is quite high. Another important thing is that what do you think is the age of this cancer? At what age do you think the patient is going to present with cervical cancer? Any ideas? Has any idea about what age usually when women present to us with the symptoms of cervical cancer? What is the usual age? Or generally, it may be there's a variation, but generally, what should be the age group? And what is the generally the predisposing factor? 35 to 45. Aiza, okay, that's very good. That's excellent. So this is what I wanted to say, that this is usually a cancer of young women, reproductive age women, and not generally like C ovary. When we talk about C ovary, when we talk about C endometrium, those two cancers usually occur at a later age, or older women after 45 years or so. But CA cervix, cervical cancer, usually occurs in a younger woman, because as we know, the etiology is the viral etiology. It's a sexually transmitted virus which predisposes to cancer, and which can occur at a very young age, uh, soon after the onset of sexual activity. And once the patient has HPV, and then if she gets cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, CIN, then that can progress to cancer within a period of 10 to 15 years. So generally, this is the age group that Isa has mentioned, that's 35 to 45 years, which is a very young age. And at this age, usually women have small children. The children are not grown up, and they need the mother, they need the family, and the mother is very important. The patient is very important for the care of the family and for her children. So you can understand that it's so important to save these women and to prevent this unnecessary mortality, which is very much avoidable. This cancer is very much preventable, like we are going to talk about how to prevent. But yes, these women can be saved, and they should not be dying due to cervical cancer. Okay, so what are the risk factors? The main risk factor, as we all know, is human papilloma virus, and there are different strains, as you all know. There are around 100 strains of HPV infection. So all of the HPV strains are not oncogenic or not so dangerous, but some of them, like 16 and 18 and 6 and 11, they are said to be most oncogenic, or more at causing predisposing to cancer, particularly 16 and 18. So HPV infections very common in reproductive age. all women who are sexually active, this is a very, very common, and it's not necessary that they should have multiple sexual partners. We must always remember that all women who develop this cancer are not are not going to give you a history of multiple sexual partners, or even their husbands may not be having multiple marriages or multiple sexual partners. It can happen even in a monogamous relationship, although the risk is much less. So it's a matter of risk, less risk or more high risk. High risk is with multiple partners and less risk with monogamous relationship. But practically, in clinical practice, we do see cases where there is no history of even polygamy or multiple sexual partners. So even a single relationship or monogamous relationship can cause cervical cancer. We must remember this because people generally think that we are not high risk. A woman who's monogamous is not at high risk. She does not need to have a pap smear or a vaccine or a prevention, and the risk is very low. It's actually not true. Every woman needs to be protected against CS cervix at a very young age because it is a preventable cancer and it's a preventable disease. So HPV infection and sexually transmitted virus, and important points in history are early age at intercourse. So in our country we ask age of marriage, but in Western society they ask age of starting of sexual activity. When did they start sexual activity? Because they can start in Western countries, sexual activity can start even in teenage sometimes, and that is important. Early age at intercourse and then multiple partners, that's a very important high risk factor. But in our country we say that again there are risk factors. People might think that early age at intercourse is not a risk factor for Pakistan, but again that is not true, because as you all know that there is no age of marriage in Pakistan. Do you know how early the girls can get married in Pakistan? Any ideas? Age of marriage in Pakistan. Although we have a law which says the girl cannot get married before 16 years. And in Sindh, now they have passed a law which says that the age of the girl should be 18 years before she can get married, and she cannot get married before 18 years. Age of the boy and the girl both should be at least 18 years. That's the age of adulthood, basically. So, but in Pakistan, there is no age. So that's very right. I'm getting the answers from Aish and Saifullah, and again, 10 to 11 years. So sometimes even before, sometimes we have child marriages of even before 10 years, even before puberty. So although the girls get puberty around 11 to 12 years, and generally our people think that now she can get married because she started having menarche, her periods have started at 12 years, so she can get married as if she has become an adult. But actually she is a small child, and she cannot be expected to be a mother. She cannot be expected to be a wife at 12 years of age and 11 years of age. So, this is a very important question in your history. Whenever you take history in gynecology, the important things that you ask are about history of onset of menarche and then age of marriage. Usually, we ask. We don't ask age of sexual activity, but we ask what is the age of marriage, and you can get any answer: 12 years, 14 years, 13 years, even sometimes less than this, right? So multiple sexual partners. So we said this is an important history. Like yesterday we were discussing sexual history for vaginal discharge. Similarly, over here it is important to take sexual history, but it will be more appropriate if we start taking history of multiple marriages or polygamy before we ask about extramarital. Okay, so because polygamy is allowed here, multiple marriages are allowed, and officially four are allowed. So you can easily ask about whether woman, it's the first marriage for the woman, or it's how many marriages the husband has. Does he have any other wives, and about the wife's previous marriages also. So that will be safe. But then, even if there is no history of polygamy, we have to ask about extramarital or multiple sexual partners. But that has to be done in a very um, appropriate way, and with understanding and with the respect for the right of the patient, that if she wants to hide that, then that's okay. We don't have to pressurize. We just have to tell them that there is a high risk for people who have multiple sexual partners, so that if they want to volunteer that information, they can volunteer. If they want to hide it, they will hide it. That's okay. Right? So, sexual history is very important to know the risk factors, age of marriage or age of early age of intercourse, so that we can assess that she might have had HPV infection at that age, and then that could have led to CIN and then led to cervical cancer. History of smoking is important because that causes immunosuppression. HIV, similarly, immunosuppression, and any other factor which can cause immunosuppression is also important for development of cervical cancer. Okay, so I think this is the most important slide for our this topic of cervical cancer, because, like I said, for final years, the main competence that we want is history, because we don't assess you on examination, we don't assess you on basic management. We can ask you, but not very advanced management and very advanced investigations also. So basically, your point of exam is basically depends on how you talk about taking history. And this is the most important, always the most important tool that we have in order to diagnose. And how do we go about it? What is the important gynecological history? Apart from age, of course, age and parity. So, presenting complaint. Whenever the patient complains of abnormal bleeding of any kind, abnormal bleeding of any kind in a reproductive age woman, particularly if she's above 30 years, like you said, the age is 35 to 45. So, any woman who is above 30 years of age and she's complaining of abnormal bleeding of any kind, we must suspect cervical cancer, and we must further evaluate and examine and try to rule out cervical cancer before we say this is hormonal or this is some other cause, or it may be a polyp also. But when we talk about differential diagnosis, we always think about the serious things first. So, although the polyp may be more common, irregular bleeding and abnormal bleeding can also be caused by a cervical polyp or endometrial polyp or fibroid polyp, but those are benign conditions. They will always be, they will always come after ruling out cervical cancer, which is more serious, which can lead to mortality. So first we rule out cervical cancer in that woman, and then we can say we have ruled out cervical cancer, and it can be anything else. It can be a polyp, it can be abnormal uterine bleeding due to fibroid, it can be due to adenomyosis, it can be due to any other hormonal, DUB, anything. But the important thing is to rule out cervical cancer whenever a woman presents with abnormal uterine bleeding, जिसको AUB कहते हैं, and or irregular. She might say the bleeding periods are irregular, or heavy vaginal bleeding, or irregular bleeding. An important point in history is you always ask about whether she's having intermenstrual bleeding or not, and whether she's having postcoital bleeding or not. And if she's a postmenopausal woman, then again postmenopausal bleeding, that is important. And whenever a woman presents with postmenopausal bleeding, we must rule out two cancers. One is cervical cancer, and the other one is endometrial cancer. So those are the two cancers that we try to exclude in postmenopausal bleeding before we say there are other causes like HRT and other things. So another important presenting complaint will be vaginal discharge, because yesterday when we were talking about vaginal discharge and when we were talking about non-infective causes, there were infections for vaginal discharge and there was non-infection cause, where again cervical cancer is very important cause for foul smelling and greenish discharge, pussy discharge. It can be blood stained, copious vaginal discharge, which is very important for diagnosis of cervical cancer, because whenever there is a cervical mass or cervical growth, it usually gets ulcerated due to sexual intercourse, and once it gets ulcerated, then it bleeds. It causes postcoital bleeding also, and then it causes infection. And whenever there's infection, there will be vaginal discharge, and the patient will say she's having foul smelling and pussy discharge and copious amount of discharge, or bad looking greenish discharge and yellowish discharge. So the two main complaints that you can be asked in the exam about how the cancer patients present, cervical cancer particularly, one is abnormal bleeding, irregular heavy bleeding, intermenstrual, postcoital, any kind of abnormal pattern of bleeding. And second important point in presenting complaint will always be a bad discharge, greenish discharge, pussy discharge, foul smelling discharge, and these 2 points. And then you can further ask about any other symptoms, like if she's saying कि hematuria hai, rectal bleeding hai, hemoptysis hai. These 3 points in history will tell us about whether the cancer has spread to adjacent organs like rectum, like bladder, and whether it has spread distantly to the lungs. If she's complaining of hemoptysis and we are suspecting she's a cervical cancer patient, that will indicate that there is metastasis to the lungs, and that's why she's complaining of hemoptysis. If she's complaining of hematuria, it usually indicates that the cancer has spread to the urinary bladder, and it is usually stage 4 cancer. So the hematuria, asking about hematuria is very important, and asking about rectal bleeding is also very important, because that indicates that the cancer might have spread to backwards to rectum. So apart from this, your other history is also important, like age parity and her medical history, of course, her gynecological history of pap smears, and her parity is important, whether she has completed her family or not. And because usually these are young women, so it's quite possible that they are married but they have not completed their family, and they would like to get some form of treatment where they can have a chance of preserving the uterus so that they can have a baby later on. So it's important to know the obstetrical history, gynecological history, past medical history. All the history is important, like usually you do all format, but particularly this is the presenting complaint, and this has to be assessed in a lot more detail in order to evaluate for cervical cancer. Okay, so then when you're taking HFPC, basically history of presenting complaint is always the most important part of history whenever we are trying to diagnose or trying to do a differential diagnosis. So the most important part of your history is HFPC. That should be always taken in detail. And along with that, sexual history is important for some patients. Like yesterday, we were talking about vaginal discharge, and we were saying sexual history is very important because you're trying to rule out STIs. And here again, HPV is an STI, so we have to take a proper sexual history, and again, a very tactful history, respecting the patient's privacy, allowing her to disclose or not disclose as she wishes, not making her embarrassed. All these things are very important. So it cannot be done without practice, of course, but it should always be done for uh, for gynecology patients. So starting from age of marriage, and we said we can ask about multiple marriages. But then multiple sexual partners should also be asked very tactfully and not pressurizing the patient, right? Multiparity has to be know, we have to know multiparity or nulliparity, history of any STIs. Because if she has a history of HIV, for example, or hepatitis, for example, then we have to rule out all STIs, and she will be high risk for HPV infection also, and that will be a risk factor for C cervix. So all these points are important in sexual history. So then after your history, we are going to do physical examination. So in physical examination, you may be asked what are the important points. So we always start with the general physical examination, and we must never forget to check the patient's vitals first, because if she is bleeding a lot, sometimes these patients complain of heavy bleeding for 2 or 3 months, and they might be very, very anemic. And sometimes, rarely, we have seen patients coming in hypovolemic shock, although that's not very common. But sometimes patients present with hypovolemic shock because they come so late to tertiary care that they might already be in cardiac failure due to severe anemia, or they might be in hypovolemic shock, and we have to do life-saving blood transfusions and hydration and everything. So checking the patient's vitals, her BP, her pulse, her temperature, everything is important. And then we do the general physical examination, where anemia is very important, of course. And usually you get severe anemia for these patients because we said the main history is heavy bleeding, irregular bleeding, abnormal bleeding, heavy bleeding, intermenstrual. So usually these patients are very anemic. Their hemoglobin might be 4 grams, 5 grams, anything like that. And so you have to check for anemia, you have to check for pallor, and then we have to check for these lymph nodes, cervical lymph nodes, inguinal lymph nodes, and we also need to do systemic examination. So never forget that a gynae patient is only got a uterus and ovaries. So we are only going to do per abdominal. No, we have to do systemic examination, particularly in patients who are coming with so much morbidity. They're coming with severe anemia. So we have to check their uh, chest, do the chest examination. We have to check the heart, the cardiac evaluation for murmurs, for heart failure, and for, although we are not very expert, gynecologists are not expert at checking the heart and checking the lungs, but generally, as a physician, we must know how to evaluate the chest, because she might be having pulmonary edema, she might be having pulmonary metastasis, she might be having heart failure. So chest examination, cardiovascular examination, all that is also important. And then we do a per abdominal examination to rule out any visceromegaly, because if they metastasize to the liver, there might be visceromegaly, there might be spleen might be enlarged, liver might be enlarged, or there might be a pelvic mass, any positive finding on per abdominal exam. And then we do a most important examination, which is per speculum examination. And per speculum examination is done to inspect the cervix. Can you see the picture? Yes, finalists, can you see this picture? This is a speculum examination, a per speculum examination, and what can you see? So this cervix is not normal. You can see here very clearly, this is a bad looking, dangerous looking tumor, fungating mass, which is occupying the whole of the cervix. A very big tumor which has hidden the normal cervix. You can't see the os, you can't see the cervical lips, you can't see cervix at all. So this is just totally occupied this growth, and you can just by looking at it, you can say that this is cancer. Although 100% diagnosis will be only on biopsy, but this is a very, very 90% diagnosis. We always say that we diagnose on speculum examination. So clinical diagnosis of cervical cancer is the most important diagnosis. Even before biopsy, we can, although we don't say to the patient कि आपको cancer हो गया है, we just say कि हमें शक हो रहा है, but in our hearts we know that this is cancer. Although not 100% sure, so we don't say it to the patient, but when we see it, then we know that this is cancer. This can't be anything else. So you diagnose cancer, cervical cancer, on your visualization, on visualizing per speculum. When you see the cervix, when you see this growth, you can say that this is cancer. And then we, a particular point to be noted for this growth is that this bleeds to touch. As soon as the speculum touches it, or as soon as we do the bimanual vaginal examination, we put our finger inside the vagina and the patient starts bleeding suddenly. So that's very, very suggestive. Again, we are sure in our hearts that this is cervical cancer. This can't be, because polyp doesn't look like this. Fibroid is very innocent, very innocent looking, very smooth looking. It doesn't look like this. No polyp looks like this. This is just cancer, and particularly if it bleeds to touch, then this is very likely to be cervical cancer, and you can diagnose it just by putting in a speculum and doing a bimanual examination. This gives you the diagnosis of cervical cancer. So it's basically a very, very clinically diagnosed cancer even before biopsy. Okay, so once we have done the examination, what do we do now? What is the next step? I want the finalists to give me some feedback. Supposing we have seen this patient in the OPD, we have taken a history, and we have done this examination, and the history is very suggestive, and the examination is showing this bad looking growth, fungating growth over the cervix. So now what do we do? What is the next step? Anybody? Okay. Anything else? So you all are correct. Investigation, biopsy, lab investigation, anything else? Anything else comes to your mind before we do biopsy, before we do investigation? What do we do? What do we do right now in the OPD? We have discovered this cancer on clinical examination and history. Now what do we do? Before we do biopsy, before we do investigation, what would you like to do? You have seen this patient. Okay, so this is Alima Fatma. She's saying we will tell the patient about her condition. Do you all agree with this? Should we tell the patient or not? How many people think we should tell the patient? No. Why not? Rimsha is saying no. Anmol is saying no. Why not? Can you tell us a little bit more? Why shouldn't we tell? Or what should we tell the patient? They're not 100% sure, yes. But what should we tell the patient? Should we tell her something, or shouldn't we tell her anything? What should we say to the patient? Because before you investigate, you have to tell her, you know? We should tell her what we suspect. Yes, that's very important, Alma. That's absolutely correct. So even though we are not 100% sure, counseling, yes, that's excellent. Counseling and telling the patient about what we are suspecting and what we have found is the most important management point at this point, before even we investigate, before we do a biopsy, because this patient has come in a very with a very serious condition, and we must know that patients also know their condition. It's not that we can get away with telling lies, and we should never tell lies. We should never say everything is okay and everything is going to be okay, and I'm going to do everything that you will be fine. We should never put the patient in false hopes, and we should never lie to the patient. We must tell her honestly what we are suspecting. If we are suspecting cancer, we must say that we are suspecting cancer. Why not? We shouldn't be scared to tell her the truth because she must be suspecting herself also. She's coming in a serious condition with a bad sort of bleeding and with a bad anemia, with a very severe anemia. So, usually in their heart, patients know there's something serious going on and they expect the doctor to be honest and to tell them whatever they are suspecting rather than to hide the condition and to withhold information that will be unethical and that will be very wrong. So before we admit the patient for investigation, this patient needs admission, of course. She needs investigation. She needs a biopsy. We need to confirm the diagnosis 100%. But before doing everything, we need to counsel. And that's very, very important. Telling her what we have found. Imagine if I'm the patient, if I'm going to a doctor, if you are a patient, you're going to a doctor. As soon as we have, the doctor has taken a history and she has done a checkup, what do we expect from the doctor? That the doctor will tell us what she found or what does she think about our condition? What does she think about us? Okay, what is wrong with me? Or what is the diagnosis? Everybody expects the doctor to tell, but generally doctors don't tell, which is very, very wrong. Yes. So Alma is very right that we should never hide anything from the patient. We have to be tactful, we have to be gentle, but we have to tell them very clearly about what we are suspecting. So actually, we have to tell them that we are suspecting something serious, so that the patient in her heart she knows that there is something serious and she needs to be in, so that she doesn't even run away. She might, otherwise she might say, Doctor Sahab, I want to go home, I'll come later on, or she might just not want to get admitted unless you tell her there's something serious and this might be cancer. So that will be the honest counseling with the patient, that we are suspecting cancer and we need to admit her, we need to confirm the diagnosis, we need to investigate further, and we need to take a biopsy, and only then we will confirm about what is the actual diagnosis. Okay, so counseling is very, very important. Okay, so suppose we have counseled the patient, we have told her about suspected cancer, and we have admitted this patient in the ward. Now what? What do we do now? So now we need to do investigations and we need to take a biopsy also. So before biopsy, um, we need to do this general condition because we need to see the severity of anemia, we need to correct her anemia, we need to stabilize her general condition. If she's going to go for a biopsy under GA, but biopsy does not have to be under GA always. It can be taken even without GA, and a punch biopsy can be taken in the OPD also, because generally you saw the mass; it was looking very friable, and taking a biopsy is not difficult. Sometimes we don't even need to take a punch biopsy when you examine the patient. The mass is already so friable that pieces of mass will come out on your finger, which can be very easily sent for biopsy. But that does not happen always. Sometimes we need to take a good biopsy under general anesthesia. So for that, we need to make her fit for general anesthesia. So we need to do all these investigations in the ward. We need to do the most important investigation is CBC and her hemoglobin. And if her hemoglobin is very low, then we need to give her blood transfusion. We need to stabilize the condition, correct her anemia, and try to stop bleeding with how do you stop bleeding? Supposing she's having a lot of bleeding and we have done a checkup on her and that has caused even more severe bleeding. So how do we stop the bleeding? Which drug do we give her for bleeding? Anybody? Anybody? Any final year student? Can you tell me what do we give for reducing the amount of vaginal bleeding in any patient? Any patient who's presenting with a fibroid, heavy periods for any patient. So Amber Ali is saying tranexamic acid. Do you all agree with this? How many students agree with tranexamic acid? Ramsha, yes, tranexamic acid. So do you all agree that we give tranexamic acid? Yes. Anybody else? Yes. Okay. So that's very good. That's excellent. So we always give tranexamic acid. We can give injection, transamine, tranexamic acid, or we can give it orally in a capsule form, 500 milligram, two capsules 3 times a day or 4 times a day. It's a very, very good drug. And we can also give NSAIDs. Yes. So Aish is saying we can give NSAIDs also. That's also very right. So usually we give a combination. Usually we give tranexamic so that we want to reduce the bleeding very significantly as much as possible and as soon as possible so that the patient recovers her hemoglobin. At the same time, we give her blood or we give her parenteral also so that we make her fit as soon as possible and she feels better after blood transfusion and after parenteral and after trying to reduce her bleeding. Both these drugs are very important. NSAIDs, mefenamic acid is very important, 500 milligram mefenamic acid, which is constant. And along with that, we give tranexamic acid. So together, these two drugs will very significantly reduce more than 50% reduction in blood flow and whatever may be the cause of bleeding. Not just this cervical cancer, but uh, due to fibroid, due to heavy periods, due to dysfunctional uterine bleeding, any kind of abnormal uterine bleeding, we treat with both these drugs together. So along with that, we do other investigations like we do a urine DR and culture. So because we have taken a history of hematuria and we do urine DR in order to rule out infection also, and also we want to rule out any hematuria in the urine. And we also want to know her other general condition, her liver, her kidneys. So kidney function, we want to know serum creatinine, we want to know the LFTs because these will indicate the stage of the disease and whether the disease has spread inside to the liver and to the kidneys or to the ureters. So, and this will also tell us about her GF fitness. So, all these investigations are going to help us evaluate the patient's general condition. They're going to tell us about staging also, and they're also going to tell us about the patient's fitness for surgery, for her biopsy under general anesthesia. We need to make her fit also, and we need to have some kind of information about her staging of the cancer also. So we do chest X-ray, which is again going to tell us about the condition of the patient and whether there's any metastasis also for fitness. Because if we are going to put her under general anesthesia, then we have to have chest X-ray for that also. And then chest X-ray will tell us if there is any evidence of chest X-ray metastasis, then we can go for a CT scan of chest also and ultrasound of chest also. So initially we do basic investigations, and then if there is something wrong, then we go for more advanced investigations, right? And then we do an ultrasound abdomen and pelvis. This is again going to tell us about staging. Ultrasound KUB is also very important because what happens is that how does this cancer spread? Another question for final year. What is the mode of spread? Because different cancers spread in different ways. Like we know that ovarian cancer spreads through peritoneum, through direct spread, direct infiltration into the peritoneum and abdominal cavity and abdominal viscera and omentum and everything gets involved. How does cervical cancer spread? Anybody? Yes. Yes, final years? Lymphatic spread, okay. Anybody else? Anybody else? So Safula is saying lymphatic spread. Any other ideas? Lymphatic, because it's a cancer, it's a CA, so we know there's lymphatic spread. Hematogenous, anything else? What are the other modes of spread that you know about? Local extension. Yes, very good. That's excellent. So local extension, first of all, direct spread. Yes, very good. Excellent. So this is a cancer which spreads locally also, and lymphatic spread is also correct. So it's not wrong. Lymphatic spread, hematogenous, everything occurs. But what occurs? What happens first? That is, it directly spreads to adjacent viscera. It directly involves, because we all know the ureters also secrete when it is spreading locally, the cervical cancer is also spreading locally. About lymphatic spread, about local spread, and hematogenous spread will be diagnosed on. Yes, we have FIGO staging. Yes, excellent. We are very good. We are going to talk about staging in a minute. So that's very right, Cephala. And you all are correct. So the lymphatic spread is there, hematogenous. Usually, hematogenous occurs a little bit late. We all know that. So once it is hematogenous spread, that means stage 4B, and that means the lungs will have metastasis, liver will have metastasis, and that's a very, very late stage where we might not be able to save the patient's life also, right? So if the chest X-ray shows metastasis, that means it has spread by hematogenous. If the CT scan abdomen shows lymph nodes are involved, or if your cervical lymph nodes are enlarged, that means lymphatic spread has occurred. But direct spread is also very important because that occurs very early, and ureters can be involved even in stage 3, that is renal failure stage, right? So we do these investigations in order to stage the disease and also to know patient's general condition and metastasis, both the things. So this is a CT scan of kidneys, a CT scan of abdomen, which is hydronephrosis. Can you see the kidneys? These are the kidneys which are swollen, and this means, what is the stage of this disease? If you do a CT scan on a patient of cervical cancer and you see hydronephrosis of the kidneys, what will be the stage? Anybody? Yes, final year. Yes, so Bushra is saying stage 3. Tareem stage 3. Aiza stage 3. Yes, very good. Excellent. So this is stage 3 because this is again local spread and ureters have been involved. Ureters have been undergone stricture and fibrosis. So that causes blockage of urine flow and hydronephrosis, and this patient will be in most probably in renal failure, and we might have to refer this patient to the urologist for nephrostomy and other things before we can treat her further. So this is also an MRI which is showing stage 4A. So what is stage 4A? Final year. What is stage 4 basically? What happens in stage 4? There's 4A and 4B. What is stage 4A and what is stage 4B? Yes, this is METs, Kiran. Yes, but what is the difference between 4A and 4B? Both are stage 4 metastasis to 4A में कहाँ metastasis होती है and 4B में कहाँ distant metastasis. That is 4B is distant metastasis. Right, absolutely right, Saifullah. Very good. And 4A is what kind of metastasis? Bladder and rectum. Very good. Excellent, Amber. So this is local spread, right? This is the tumor, and this is extending backwards into the rectum, and this is extending anteriorly into the bladder. So this is local direct infiltration, or you can say direct spread to the adjacent organs, just like it spread to above to the ureters, below it spreads to the rectum, and it goes to the bladder. So that is 4A, and this can be diagnosed on MRI. So previously, when MRI was not so available, we used to do staging by surgical intervention. Like we used to send the patient for sigmoidoscopy to the surgeons, and we used to send the patient for cystoscopy to the urologist. And urologist would tell us whether bladder is involved. If the bladder mucosa is involved, then stage 4A. And if the surgeons